Welcome to Tutorial 3 of your Web Development for Beginners course. Yesterday, you set out the basic structure of your website using HTML. Today, you're going to style your website so that it looks a bit more impressive. To help you do this, we'll be introducing the second building block of the World Wide Web, CSS. We'll explain what exactly CSS is and show you how it can be used to bring plain HTML pages to life. We'll also consider how to build websites that are mobile responsive. By the end of this tutorial, you'll be well versed in the basics of CSS and you'll have a fully responsive website to show for it. Ready? Let's do this. So, what is CSS? We've mentioned CSS a couple of times, but we never really looked into it. So, in this tutorial, we'll look into what CSS is and try to add some styles to our page. CSS, in a nutshell, is just a way of adding styles to your page, making it more colorful, adding some structure, making it such that it works well on all the screens and devices that you might want to run your website on, and so on. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, but you absolutely don't need to worry about that right now. For now, just remember that CSS is a way of adding styles to your web page. So, let's dive straight in and learn how to write CSS. So, as you can see, this is what we wrote yesterday. It is the HTML, and if you go to your browser, this is how it looked like. This is just the structure of our page as we discussed. So right now we need to think, how can we write CSS? There are multiple ways of writing CSS, but I'll be only showing you one, and that is what we'll be using in this tutorial because it's what you can use for your next projects as well. So the first thing that you need to do is create a new file in the portfolio folder by right-clicking on the folder and clicking New File, and then you click Command S to save it, or Control S if you're on Windows or Linux, and it will ask you to give it a name. We give it style.css. So now that we have a style.css, we can actually write CSS here, and let's see what happens. Let's just say color is red, save it, go back, refresh the page. Nothing happened. That's probably because we also need to include our page, our CSS file, into the HTML page that we are building, because that's how the browser knows what CSS file to load. So let's go back to the HTML page, and in the head section here, just below the title, let's create a new tag, new HTML tag, called link, and then you'll write rel equals style sheet, and you'll write href styles.css. That's the name of our file, and then you'll close it, save it, go back to your browser, hit refresh, and you see our paragraph tag is now red because the CSS that we wrote here has started to work. We'll look into what this means, or what this particular CSS tag means, in just a bit, but for now, you have a page ready that has a CSS file included so that we can write some CSS. So, CSS can't really do anything on its own. It needs HTML to know where to attach the style that you write. So a CSS selector is a way of pointing to the HTML element that we want to style. So you can't really just say, I want color red, because the browser would ask you, what do you want red color to be applied to? And that is where CSS selectors come in. It is a way to tell the browser that this is the element that I want to be red in color. There are three types of CSS selectors. There is the element selector, there is the class selector, and there is the ID selector. Let's just write it down so that we have it somewhere. Element selector, class selector, and ID selector. I just commented out. Yep. Okay. So what we wrote here tells the browser that look in the page for all the paragraph tags, the P tags, and make them color red. As you can tell, P here is an element, so this selector is an element selector. It's very easy to understand. So let's take another example here. let's see H3. We have used H3, heading 3 at a bunch of places. So let's select that. H3. And inside of here, we write color green this time. We go back to the page and we refresh it. And you see the H3s in the page, this one and this one, have turned green because the element selector worked. Okay, so that was easy. Now there are two other selectors that we'd use much more often than the element selector because it's just a lot more cleaner to use them. There's the class selector and there's the ID selector. You use a class selector when you have multiple elements that need to have the same color or same property, same CSS property. So let's go back to the page and say, I want these list items, all these 6 list items, to be of the same color. How would you do it? You can easily just select the list that you want to color, or you can give them a class name so that it does not color every other list that is on the page, because as you see, we also have a list here and we don't want this to be colored differently. So let's just give these items a different class. So the way you give an element a class name is by adding the class attribute. We learned about attribute yesterday. And we write about list item. It could be anything as long as it is like a valid name. You can't just have a dash there. You need to give it a proper name. So just copy it at all these places. Remember that we are giving this class attribute to the HTML elements because we want to see how to use the class selector in CSS. So this is the pre-work for that. So you have this and you have this. And then you copy one of these so that we don't have to type it again. And then we go back here. And the way you do when you select a class is by adding a dot, a full stop before the name. So you do a dot and then you write the name of the class, open curly braces, and then you write the properties that you want to give to this element. So in this case, I want to make the font italic, for example. So let's try font style italic. Notice how Sublime Text Editor already gives me the suggestions. That's the great thing about using this tool. It reduces your typing effort. Let's go back, let's refresh, and you see now these 3 headlines, these 3 titles have changed to italic. But if you go back and you see here, these are also list items, but they are not italic because we didn't use the li element here, the element selector, but we used the class name. Had I used the li here, let's try that, li, font style italic, and I refresh, and you see even these turned italic, which is not what I wanted. So that is the reason I used the class selector. So the last one is ID selector. Just use an ID selector when the thing that you're styling is like a one-off. So for example, my name is just coming up once in this page. So I'll just say ID, the ID attribute, and I say something like my name. And I save it, I go back to CSS. The way you select an ID selector is by using a hash symbol. So you say hash, and then you write the ID, the name of the ID. What is my name? My dash name. And then you open curly braces, and then you give it some property. In this case, I can give it color blue, just as an example. And I go back to this page, refresh, and you see my name here is blue in color. So to summarize, we use element selector for HTML elements. You can write the name of the HTML element directly. We use class selector for similar elements, and for that you'd have to give the attribute class to your HTML elements. And then we have the ID selector for one-off things that you want to style, and we also use the ID attribute here in the HTML, and then we select it using the hash symbol. So those are our CSS selectors. CSS grids are a way of visually structuring content on your page. HTML by default just stacks content one below the other. So if you write H1, paragraph, some list and something, it would be like one below the other. But often that is not what you want. You want your page to be a little more left to right as well. CSS grids come in handy because a grid is just like a table. Like a table, it has some rows and some columns, and then you can have HTML elements that go into particular sections of your table, of your grid. So in this section, we'll be looking at how to create a CSS grid, and we'll be actually using it a couple of times throughout our course. So let's look into that. So we go back to the styles. We have written some styles here that we'll just remove because we don't need it now. I'll take you to this page which explains CSS grids in our course. Here you can see this is a grid. This has 3 columns and 2 rows. Let's try to create that with CSS. First, we'll need an HTML table. So here you can see we have a div which has a class name here, which we'll use to select this div. And then we have some nested divs inside of the div with just the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just for an example. And let's see how we can create this structure here, this grid that we have in this image here. So what we do is we have grid table, we select it using the class selector in CSS, open parentheses, and then you write display grid, which tells the browser that this div is going to be a grid div, like a parent. Then inside of it, you can write grid template rows, which is like, what's the template of the rows? How are the rows supposed to look like? For now, we don't care about what's the exact size of the rows or anything. So for that reason, we can just make it auto. So we write auto twice because we want to have 2 rows. And similarly, we have grid template columns property, and it will take auto, auto, auto. So we have 3 autos here because we want 3 columns of auto width. So if we go back to the course, now you can see we have a grid like this. Now if we have grid items, we can actually tell the browser that, hey, I want the 3 to go in this position. We'll see how this works exactly when we work on the portfolio project. Mobile responsiveness. What is it? It sounds like a very complicated word, but in reality, it just means making your web page displayable, pretty on mobile phones, tablets, televisions, desktops, any device possible. The way we do it is with media queries. So let's look at media queries in CSS. So we'll be using the grid that we wrote in the last section to actually demonstrate how media queries work in CSS. So we see here that we have 3-column layout on the grid. 3 columns might be a good idea on a desktop, but on the mobile phone, depending on the size of each section, it might get a bit too crammed in. To fix that, we can use media queries. So let's say on a mobile phone, instead of having 3 columns, we just want 1 column. So we had 6 cells, 2 by 3. If we just have 1 column, then it would be 6 rows. So let's just write a media query and see how it works. Media max width 600 pixels, and then you open parentheses, and this is the media query. The thing to note here is that this media query takes in a condition. A condition is when that code inside of the media query is actually executed. So here I say max width 600 pixels. What this means is the code inside of here would come into effect below 600 pixels, below the browser shrinks to 600 pixels. What is 600 pixels? It's the size of the browser, and below 600 pixels is usually for mobile phones. They are smaller in size. So you can write the same selector here, grid table, open parentheses, and you only write the CSS properties that are going to be changing. So our template columns, we said we only want 1 column on mobile, and then naturally on the rows side, the 2 would become 6. So we write grid template rows, and then we write auto, 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 auto. Simple, right? So here you have 2 rows and 3 columns, which is 6 cells. And here you have 1 column and 6 rows. So in the end, you still have 6 cells, but these would be displayed one below the other, which is what we want on mobile devices. So that's media queries. So now we move on to our portfolio project and apply whatever we have learned in CSS and a bit more to the project itself. So I've cleared everything that we wrote just to learn CSS. And now we have this page, HTML, that we wrote yesterday, and then a blank CSS file. So let's refresh the page and see what we have. Yes, so it is exactly the same as we left it yesterday. First of all, let's start by giving the whole web page a container. A container, just like the name suggests, is a place that contains all of our data, useful data. So we don't want our page to stretch all the way to the end of the screens. It doesn't look super nice. So let's fix it to some fixed width. Okay, so I have surrounded our entire HTML content inside of another div, and that has the class container so that we can select it in CSS. So let's go to CSS and see what we can do with it. So I've given a couple of properties to our container class. The first one says that the size of the page cannot exceed 840 pixels. If it is exceeding, it will just stay at the maximum of 840. And the next one says, give me equal margins on both the sides so that the page content can be centered in the browser. So let's go back to our page and refresh, and you see everything is centered. This already looks a lot nicer because you don't have to view all the way to the end of the screen to see what the content is. Next up, we make some tweaks to the introduction section. So this is the introduction section. Let's give this an appropriate class name, intro, so that we can select it in CSS. Intro, and we can tell it that the text should be aligned center. So text align center. We go back and we see the introduction section is now center aligned. So next up is the about section, this one. This one. So I want this to be arranged side by side. So I am, and then I like to. And I don't want these ugly bullet points. I want everything aligned center. So let's see how we can do that. Okay, so let's look what has changed here. In the About section, I have given everything that I'm going to style a new class name. So you see the outermost division here has the About Grid class because I'm going to make it a grid. Then there is the I am and the I like to section. And then inside of them, you have two lists with the About List class. It's the same because it's going to take in the same styles. So let's see. We go to CSS and you see the About Grid is declared the display type of grid. Then you have the grid template columns, which is 50-50%, which means I want equal width columns on both the sides. And then I have the I am and I like section, which are text aligned center. And then I have the About List, with the list style none property that removes any bullet points that we had. So let's go back to the page, refresh it, and we see everything is center aligned. We don't have the bullet points on the list. And yeah, this is good. To actually see how the grid is structured, I'll tell you something. So you can right click on the page and then you can click inspect. This pops up a new window from the bottom of the page or the side. And here, let me just make it the bottom. Okay. Here you can actually see the HTML that you wrote. So we have the different sections, the container, intro, about grid, and then we have the about list. And if I hover on the about grid section, Chrome, the browser, automatically tells me that it is a table with 2 columns. And if you look on the side here, you see the CSS that we wrote for that particular class. So display grid template columns, 50%, 50%. So if you go back to your code, you see this is exactly what is Chrome is giving us. So anything that you have written styles for, say container, if you clicked it and see here, you have all the CSS that you wrote for that particular class. So this is called Chrome Developer Tools. You use it all the time as web developers to see what CSS was written, or if anything went wrong or is not working as per our expectations, we can just look into here what Chrome is reading and see if there is any problem with our code. So this is exactly how I wanted the intro section to be like, side by side. But if you use a special tool in Chrome DevTools, this is the icon. If you click it, you can actually set the page and see how it looks like on phones. So here you have a list of mobile phones and tablets. You can select, say, iPhone 6, 7, 8. And here you see the page is not looking good at all. I mean, it's tiny and it's not at all responsive. So what we need to do here is tell the browser that this is a mobile phone and I want the content to be displayed appropriately. So first off, I write this meta tag at the top of the page, which tells the browser that it shouldn't just zoom out in case something doesn't fit, but display it at the phone's resolution so that things aren't tiny. So if we go back and refresh the page, you see now our page is looking a bit better, but it's still a bit crammed in here, you see, with these two side by side. And if the phone screen is even smaller, say pick iPhone 5, it looks even more crammed. What I want here is these sections to be arranged one below the other. So let's see how we can do that with media queries. So I've written a media query here. So it says media max width 480 pixels and then run this code. So anything on any screen size that is less than 480 pixels, I want this CSS to fire. So this is the same as the about grid we wrote here, except that the grid template columns, instead of them being 50%, 50%, it is now just one column with 100%. Instead of having two elements side by side, we'll just have one below the other. So let's go to the page again and click refresh. And here you see the two sections that we had are now one below the other. That's the power of CSS media queries. Similar to the about section, now we'll change our portfolio section so that it looks a little nicer on mobile phones and desktop. So here is what we have done. We have given a class name to all of the elements in the portfolio section. So the heading becomes projects heading. All the images get project image. And what we have done here is we have surrounded all the 4 images with their own special div, and we have called it projects grid. So if we move on to the CSS section, you see the heading is center aligned. The projects grid becomes a grid, and then you have 50% column size so that each image is taking 1/2 of the screen. And then you have the project image to justify as center so that it shows in the center of the grid. And then you have some padding, which is like the spacing around the image. So that's 4%. And then you have a media query here that has the project's grid, and we tell it to make the grid one column below 650 pixels so that it looks nice on mobile phones. So let's try to run it. So we go to our page and we see the way it looks now, and then we refresh. So yeah, so the title is in the center and then the images are a little more spaced and looking nice. But what's interesting is that if I click this button and if I select responsive, you see they are one below the other, and if I slowly increase the size of the screen, and the moment you see the screen resolution in the top here, and the moment I increase it above 650, you see it becomes 2 columns instead of 1. So that's the media query in action. You can actually see it putting the style. So if you select the project's grid here, you can see the display grid template columns property, and once I change it, you see the media query coming in action and overriding this property with this, making the column 100% in width, thus making it 1 column layout. So that's the portfolio section. Next up, we are going to make the same edits, making the layout a bit nicer on the links and footer section. Okay, so what I have done here is I've given class names to the links and footer section wherever appropriate and wherever we need to add custom styling. So I've created this master class that is that has the links and the contact form section nested inside of it. Then you see links here, and this would be, you could give it class name, say contact form. We don't need it because we are not currently styling it right now. So let's just remove that. There you have it. Then you have the list with the list class name, and then you have some of the previous things that we typed here. So if we go to the CSS, you see this is what I wrote just now. You have the links and contact, the master div, and you define it as a grid. But this time, instead of 50-50%, we give it 30 and 70% because the list of links is just going to be a very narrow division. So you don't need it to be like half of the screen size. And we just center the links, and when we remove the styling from the links as we did previously, here, just like with the project's grid section, we at less than 650 pixels, we make the grid 1 column so that it does not look crammed in on tiny screens. So if we go back and we refresh the page, everything looks all right because on desktop it is supposed to look the same, but if you use the Chrome DevTools, you'll see the grid is now showing. And if I use the responsive web tool in Chromium, so you see the links and the contact form showing side by side. But if I reduce the browser width, below 650 pixels, you have the links section and then the contact section, just like we wanted. It's not looking super pretty, but we are going to work on it. But for now, it is very responsive. So you can go below that and yeah, everything works. So that's it for the links and the contacts form section. So that's just about it for tutorial 3. It was certainly a lot of CSS, but look where we started and where we are at right now. That's the power of a few lines of code. We suggest you go through the course material for the day once again, perhaps a couple of hours later, and see if there was anything you didn't understand the first time. I'm already looking forward to the next tutorial, where you'll dig deeper into CSS and make your web page look beautiful. See you there!